11:14 at night. That is the exact time Marcus Hale stepped out of his own car, alone, and followed a woman he had paid for 6 years but never truly known. He told himself he was protecting his property. He was lying to himself. Because somewhere beneath that excuse, Marcus already sensed he was about to lose something far more valuable than money. For 6 years, Rosa had cleaned every room of his $40 million mansion, and in 6 years, Marcus Hale never once asked where she disappeared to every single night. He never asked about the paper bags she quietly packed from his kitchen before she left. He never asked why her car vanished into the dark at the exact same hour, night after night, like clockwork. He simply assumed she went home. He was wrong. And what he found that night would not just break his heart. It would force him to face a debt from his own past that he thought he had buried forever. He had built an empire from nothing, and men who build empires from nothing rarely miss a detail. Every contract, every handshake, every number on every spreadsheet passed beneath his eyes before it passed beneath anyone else's. He had once walked away from a 9-figure acquisition over a single line buried on page 40 of a contract that his own lawyers had missed. That was who Marcus Hale was, a man who noticed everything. And yet, for 6 years, the woman who moved quietly through his home twice a week had remained a complete stranger to him, and somehow that had never once troubled him. He could recall the exact terms of deals he had closed a decade earlier. He could not recall a single detail about the woman who had scrubbed his floors and folded his laundry for 6 straight years. Who was Rosa really before she walked into his life? Why had she never once asked him for a raise, a favor, or a single personal conversation in 6 years? And why, out of every person working under his roof, was she the only one who left at exactly 11 o'clock, without fail, as though someone somewhere was counting on her to arrive on time? Marcus told himself these were foolish questions, the kind of paranoid thinking that came from too many years of trusting no one completely. In his world, everyone wanted something. Every smile hid a request. Every quiet, unassuming employee eventually revealed some hidden angle, some favor they had been building toward for months or years. He had learned that lesson the hard way, more than once, and it had shaped him into the guarded man he was now. That night, sitting alone in his study long after the house had gone quiet, he found himself replaying old security footage for a matter that had nothing to do with Rosa at all. He was reviewing a separate concern involving a contractor who had been in and out of the property for weeks. But there, in a single paused frame, buried among hours of unrelated footage, was the moment everything started to unravel. Rosa, standing at his pantry shelf near midnight during a shift that should have already ended, quietly filling a paper bag with food that was never hers to take. It was such a small thing. A few groceries, bread, canned vegetables, a carton of eggs. A woman who had never taken anything from him in 6 years, taking something now, carefully, deliberately, as though she had done it 100 times before. And yet Marcus could not look away from that frame, because some old buried instinct told him this was not about hunger. This was about something he did not yet understand, something with a pattern behind it, something that had clearly been happening for far longer than one single night. He rewound the footage further, past week after week of archived recordings, and there it was, over and over, the same quiet routine repeated with almost mechanical precision. Rosa, packing a bag near the end of every shift. Rosa, checking her watch before 11. Rosa leaving through the side entrance rather than the front, as though some part of her preferred not to be seen walking out with what she carried. Marcus sat back in his chair, the glow of the monitor the only light in the room, and felt something shift quietly inside him that he did not yet have a name for. Rosa had come into his employment 7 years earlier, recommended by an agency that vetted its staff carefully, and in all that time, she had never given him a single reason to doubt her. She showed up early. She left exactly on schedule, save for the small window each night when she lingered in the kitchen. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then only briefly, politely, as though she had learned long ago that saying too much to a man like Marcus Hale was never worth the risk. He had never asked about her family. He had never asked where she lived, what she had lost, or what she was still fighting for. In his mind, she existed only inside the walls of his mansion, appearing at 9 and disappearing at 11, and nothing about her life outside those hours had ever crossed his mind. That, more than anything, was about to change. Marcus spent the rest of that night unable to sleep, turning the image over and over in his mind. He told himself there had to be a reasonable explanation, something simple, something that would let him close the laptop and forget the entire matter by morning. Perhaps she was struggling financially and too proud to ask for help directly. Perhaps she had a large family to feed and had convinced herself that a bit of extra food from a man who would never notice was not truly wrong. He tried each explanation on for size, and none of them settled the growing unease sitting in his chest. Because the more he tried to convince himself of a simple answer, the more a single question refused to leave him alone. Where did she go every night, and why did it suddenly feel like the answer mattered more than anything else in his life? By the time the sun rose over the estate, Marcus had made a decision he would not have made a week earlier. A decision that would have seemed beneath him, unnecessary, even paranoid, to the man he had been just 24 hours before. Tonight he decided he would follow her. He told no one of his plan, not his driver, not his assistant, not a single soul in the small circle of people he trusted with the details of his life. This was something he needed to see for himself, without an audience, without the risk of word reaching Rosa before he had answers. He spent the day rehearsing the conversation he might have with her if he was wrong, the apology he might owe her, and beneath all of it, a quieter fear he refused to examine too closely, the fear that he was not wrong at all. The day passed slower than any day had in years. Marcus sat through 2 meetings without hearing a single word spoken to him, his mind circling back again and again to that paused frame, to the paper bag, to the 11 o'clock departures he had never once questioned. His assistant asked twice if he was feeling unwell. He waved the question away both times. By the time evening came, he found himself watching the clock the way a man watches a countdown. And when Rosa finally gathered her things and walked toward the door at exactly 11, Marcus was already waiting by the window, keys in hand, heart pounding in a way he had not felt since the earliest, most desperate days of building his company. He told himself one last time that this was simply about accountability. He no longer believed it. He followed her taillights out of the gated community he had spent his entire life building himself into, past the private security booths and manicured lawns that had come to define his world, and into streets he had not driven through in over 20 years. The farther she drove, the more the city around him changed. The buildings growing older, the streetlights growing dimmer, storefronts giving way to boarded windows and quiet, empty blocks. He kept his distance carefully, 2 cars back, the way he imagined it was done in the films he never had time to watch. Somewhere in that drive, the businessman in Marcus Hale went quiet, and something far more human took over, a feeling he could not name, equal parts guilt and fear and a strange, aching curiosity about a woman he realized he had never once truly seen. At one point, her car slowed near an intersection, and for a long, uneasy moment, Marcus was certain she had spotted him. He eased off the road, letting a delivery truck pass between them, his pulse hammering against his ribs. But she pulled forward again without a glance in his direction, and Marcus exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding. It struck him, in that small moment of fear, just how unfamiliar this feeling was to him. He was a man accustomed to being followed, watched, studied by competitors and journalists alike. He had never once been the one doing the watching. And something about being on this side of it, small and uncertain in the dark, made him feel closer to the truth than any boardroom ever had. Rosa's car finally slowed in front of a building most people would drive past without a second glance, its brick walls worn by years of neglect, its windows dark and empty from the outside, a faded sign above the door too weathered to read. Marcus parked across the street and watched her step out, paper bag in hand, and walk toward the entrance with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. For a moment, he almost turned the car around. For a moment, he almost convinced himself that whatever this was, it was none of his business, and the right thing to do was drive home and forget he had ever paused that security footage. But then the lights inside the building flickered on, one by one, and Marcus saw shapes moving behind the glass, and every instinct in him told him to stay exactly where he was. He sat in that car for nearly 20 minutes, watching shadows cross behind the windows, trying to piece together what he was looking at. At first, he considered the worst: a trafficking operation, a drug house, some quiet criminal enterprise operating in the shadows of a city he thought he understood completely. He almost reached for his phone to call the police right then, before something stopped him. Some instinct that told him what he was watching did not carry the tension of danger, but something closer to routine, even comfort. This was not a woman meeting a lover in secret. This was not a woman selling stolen goods. No matter how badly some quiet, guilty part of him almost wished that were the simpler answer, an answer that would let him close this chapter with anger instead of whatever was waiting for him now. Whatever was happening inside that building was larger than anything he had imagined on the drive over, and the longer he watched, the more Marcus understood that the woman who had spent 6 years quietly cleaning his home was living an entire second life he knew absolutely nothing about. And somewhere in that understanding, a colder thought settled over him, one that would not leave him alone for the rest of that night, because deep down, Marcus already sensed that whatever Rosa had been hiding was not simply about her, it was about him. He could not explain the feeling, only that it sat heavy in his chest, the same way it did in the final hours before a deal collapsed, when every instinct screamed that something important was about to change, and there was no longer any way to stop it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Finally, unable to sit in the dark any longer, Marcus crossed the street and stepped inside the building himself. The door was unlocked, worn smooth by years of hands passing through it. What greeted him was nothing he had prepared for. A room full of teenagers and young adults, most of them no older than 21, sat around mismatched tables eating a warm meal that Rosa had just finished setting out, food that Marcus recognized instantly from his own kitchen, the same bread, the same vegetables, the same careful portions he had watched her pack the night before on the security footage. Every face in that room turned toward him at once, and for a long, silent moment, nobody moved. A young woman near the back quietly pulled her chair closer to the boy beside her, as though bracing for the stranger in the doorway to be trouble. Then Rosa turned, saw him standing there, and instead of the fear or the guilt Marcus expected to see, her expression settled into something closer to relief, as though a weight she had carried for years had finally, quietly, been set down. She did not scramble for an excuse. She did not ask how he had found her. She simply looked at him and said only one sentence, calm and steady, as though she had rehearsed it in her mind 100 times over the years, without ever expecting to say it out loud. "I always wondered when you would finally follow me." The room stayed silent around them, a dozen young faces watching a scene they clearly did not fully understand. And Marcus realized, standing frozen in that doorway, that he understood even less than they did. Marcus stood there, unable to speak, unable to fully process what he was looking at. Rosa gently set down the tray she was holding and gestured toward a small table near the corner, away from the others, and Marcus found himself following her there without a word. The same way, he thought distantly, that she had followed his instructions in his own kitchen for 6 long years, except now the roles had quietly reversed. She explained, slowly and without drama, that she had been running this small shelter for nearly 4 years, feeding and sheltering young people who had aged out of the foster care system with nowhere left to go and no one left to call. Young people the system simply released into the world at 18 with a bag of belongings and no safety net beneath them. Every bit of it, the food, the small stipends she quietly handed out for bus fare and job interviews, the mattresses lined against the far wall, had come from her own wages Marcus had paid her for years without ever once asking what she did with them. He remembered, with a discomfort he could not quite name, the bonus he had given her the previous Christmas, handed over almost carelessly, the same amount he might tip a driver for a long trip. He had never wondered where that money went either. Rosa continued speaking, her voice never rising, never seeking sympathy, simply laying out facts the way a person does when they have long since made peace with a burden others would find unbearable. 4 years, she said. Sometimes 6 young people at a time. Sometimes 10. He asked her, almost desperately, why she had never told him, why she had never asked him for a single dollar towards something this important, something that clearly mattered more to her than anything else in her life. Her answer would not leave him for the rest of his life. "Because I didn't think you'd want your name anywhere near this place." That single sentence hit Marcus harder than anything a boardroom rival had ever said to him in 30 years of business. He had been insulted before, outmaneuvered before, even betrayed before, But nothing had ever landed the way that quiet, matter-of-fact sentence landed, because there was no anger in it at all. Only a tired, resigned certainty, the kind that only comes from years of watching a person closely enough to know exactly who they are. Why wouldn't he want his name near something like this? What had he done, or failed to do, that made a woman he paid generously assume he would want no part of saving young people with nowhere else to turn? He pressed her for an answer, his voice cracking slightly in a way that surprised even him, and Rosa hesitated for the first time since he had known her. It was the first hesitation he had ever seen from her in 7 years, and somehow that small pause frightened him more than anything she had said so far. She rose from the table slowly and walked toward a small shelf in the corner of the room, one hand trailing briefly along its edge, as though gathering the courage for something she had avoided for a very long time. She picked up a single photograph that had been sitting there, face down, untouched, and held it for a long moment before finally turning it over and placing it gently into his hands. Marcus looked down at the image, and every certainty he had ever held about his own past began to quietly fall apart. The photograph was of a man Marcus had not allowed himself to think about in 15 years. Daniel Reyes, his former business partner. The two young men who had once spent entire nights sketching business plans on napkins in a diner that no longer existed. The man Marcus had pushed out in a hostile buyout decades earlier, taking full control of a company they had built together from nothing, leaving Daniel with almost nothing to show for a decade of his life's work. Marcus had told himself for years that it was simply business, that Daniel would land on his feet, that this was how empires were built, that sentiment had no place in a boardroom where survival depended on decisiveness. He had repeated that justification to himself so many times over 15 years that it had almost become true in his own mind. He had never once looked back to see what actually happened to the man he left behind, had never allowed himself to wonder, in a single quiet moment over 15 years, whether Daniel Reyes had found his footing again, or whether he had simply disappeared into the version of the world that men like Marcus rarely had to look at. Rosa's voice, quiet and steady, finally broke the silence hanging over the small table between them. "Daniel was my brother-in-law," she said, "and he died homeless, 4 years after you took everything he had." The words landed slowly, each one settling into Marcus like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward long after it had sunk beneath the surface. Marcus lowered himself slowly into the nearest chair, the photograph still trembling slightly in his hands, unable to look away from the young, confident face of a man he had once called his closest friend. He tried to speak and found that nothing came. Rosa did not fill the silence with comfort. She simply let it sit there between them, the way grief and guilt often do, without rushing either of them toward forgiveness before it was earned. Rosa continued, her voice never rising, never accusing, simply laying out a truth she had carried alone for far too long. After Daniel's death, his son had nowhere left to go. No family able to take him in, no system willing to fight for him the way he deserved, passed instead from one overcrowded placement to another, until he aged out with nothing but a duffel bag and a photograph of a father he barely remembered. Rosa had stepped in herself, raising him quietly, working 2 jobs at once for years before ever taking the position in Marcus's own household, eventually taking that position specifically, deliberately, without ever revealing who she truly was or what connected her to his past. She had built this shelter not out of guilt and not out of anger toward Marcus, but because she refused to let any other young person disappear the way Daniel's son so easily could have. Marcus asked, almost in a whisper, where that boy was now. Rosa nodded toward the far side of the room, toward a young man asleep on a worn couch near the window. No older than 20, a paperback novel resting open on his chest, completely unaware that the man responsible for his father's downfall was sitting only a few feet away for the very first time in his life. Marcus stared at him for a long, unbearable moment, searching his face for traces of the partner he had once called his closest friend. The same sharp jawline, the same restless way of resting one hand beneath his chin, even in sleep, and the partner whose downfall he had spent 15 years quietly refusing to examine too closely, came rushing back to him all at once, undeniable now, sitting only a few feet away. Every justification he had built for himself over the years, every version of the story where he was simply a smart businessman making hard decisions, collapsed silently in that room, replaced by the plain, undeniable weight of what his ambition had actually cost. He thought of the diner napkins, the long nights, the handshake that had once sealed their partnership before another handshake, years later, quietly ended it. He thought of every meeting where Daniel's name had come up only briefly, dismissed with the same tired line about business being business. And he understood now, sitting in a room he never could have imagined existed, that somewhere in this city, for 15 years, the consequences of that single decision had continued unfolding without him, indifferent to whether he ever chose to look. For a long time, Marcus said nothing at all. He simply sat there, in a room he never could have imagined existed only hours earlier, surrounded by young people who owed their safety not to a billionaire, but to a woman who had quietly given everything she had without ever asking for recognition. He thought of every check he had ever signed without a second thought, every deal he had ever closed without considering the people left behind, every quiet employee he had walked past in his own hallways, without once wondering what weight they carried home with them each night. And he understood, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, that wealth had allowed him to stop seeing the consequences of his own decisions entirely. Rosa had spent 6 years watching him from the edges of his own home, saying nothing, expecting nothing, simply doing the quiet work of repairing a debt that was never hers to repay in the first place. He asked her, quietly, why she had stayed in his employment at all, why a woman who clearly understood exactly who he was and what he had done would choose to spend 6 years working inside his home rather than as far from him as possible. Her answer, once again, carried no bitterness in it at all. She told him she had taken the position because it paid well enough to fund the shelter, yes, but also because some part of her had always believed that a man capable of building something as vast as he had built was still capable of understanding, one day, what that building had cost. She had not been waiting for an apology. She had simply been waiting, patiently, for him to finally notice something outside the walls of his own success. In the weeks that followed, Marcus did not simply write a check and disappear the way a man of his position so easily could have. He returned to that building again and again, first to repair it properly, replacing the failing roof and the broken heating before the coldest months arrived, then to sit at the same worn tables where Daniel's son ate his meals, slowly learning his name, his story, the small details of a life Marcus had never once considered during the 15 years he spent refusing to look back. He learned that the boy wanted to study engineering. He learned that he still kept his father's old watch, broken and unwound, in the drawer beside his bed. He did not do any of this publicly. He did not announce it to the world, did not summon a photographer to document his sudden generosity for the sake of his own reputation. He simply showed up, night after night, the same way Rosa had shown up for 4 quiet years before he ever knew to follow her, learning slowly what it meant to give something without needing anyone to witness it. For the first time since he had built his empire, Marcus Hale was not trying to win anything. He was simply trying, finally, to see the people his success had walked past. Rosa never asked Marcus for a single dollar in the 6 years she worked in his home, because what she needed from him could never have been bought with a check or a bonus handed over at Christmas. She needed him to notice. She needed him to finally see the quiet cost paid by the people who serve, clean, and care for others in silence, expecting nothing in return, year after year, without a single word of recognition. Marcus Hale spent 30 years building an empire, and only one night learning what it had actually cost the people standing closest to him the entire time. Sometimes the people who serve us are quietly carrying the weight of who we used to be, waiting patiently, without complaint, for the night we finally decide to follow them and find out. Would you have followed her that night? Or would you have looked away and told yourself it was none of your business? Let us know in the comments below. We would love to hear what you would have done and whether you saw this coming from the very beginning. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story like this one.